Hi, Carrie. You make a really interesting comment here about the rain dancers, and I completely understand um, why you argue that. But the problem is, you're committing yourself to the idea, and maybe you're right, but you're committing yourself to the idea that knowledge is ultimately subjective, which means that my knowledge, right, can be different than your knowledge, and if that's the case, then ultimately my belief can be both true and false simultaneously, which means you accept the possibility that knowledge can be contradictory. If knowledge can be contradictory, then you ultimately are left with a sort of incoherence problem, such that you can't say that anything can ultimately make sense. Now, and I don't think you want to argue that, because if you do want to argue that, then that means that nothing goes, right? That means that science fails. That means that mathematics fails. That means that psychology fails. It means all knowledge is utterly subjective. We're left in a sort of isomorphic state in which the only thing we know are what we think, but we'll never ever know that if whether or not what we think is true. You essentially dispense with the category of truth. Now, but let's go back to this idea, because I think you're right that this is sort of a problem, is namely, what do we mean? Knowledge can be based upon experience, and your experience is subjective. Does that necessitate, though, that, first off, I think you have to make a distinction that experience isn't the same as knowledge, right? For instance, it seems to me that the rain dancers experience the world in one way. And the problem is that they think that that really is the case. That is how it is. And that's the difference between an opinion and knowledge, right? But the trick is, how do you move from out of that? And if you're right, if you take the idea that knowledge comes from experience alone, which the empirical model, empiricism, which you may be completely right and justified in thinking, and many philosophers join you there, that doesn't mean that we have to dispense with the possibility that there is such a thing as knowledge, right? Couldn't it be the case that what counts as knowledge is when we all have the same experience, or in principle, and our experience is never different, right? Such that, for instance, take something very simple. How would you, let's say you see someone hit your car, driving, you park your car, you walk away, and you see someone in the park that run into it and hit it. Now, if you are committed to the idea that it's ultimately all subjective, then the person who's driving the car could have said, no, I didn't, I actually hit the bushes. I had a different experience than you. And you can see there's never in principle any way to arbitrate that claim. But how do we arbitrate it? Well, namely, we have witnesses. We have a number of different people whose experience matches. But here's the trick. If your experience matches, then doesn't that mean that there is a world outside of our experiences that is determining what's wrong or what's right? It's a very difficult sort of philosophical problem, and I think you're right to sort of raise a number of these questions here. But do you really think that I guess it's possible, it is possible that the rainmakers could cause the rain to fall, but it's highly unlikely, actually, right? It seems what the difference between us and the rain dancers is that we understand we have reasons, argumentative, universal claims, right? And we use those claims, those reasons, as justification for our knowledge. We use that account, right? You can think here of Socrates. It seems like we have this extra demonstrable account that helps to universalize our experience so that we make sense of our experience, right? So, I don't know. I see why you're arguing what you do, but ultimately, I think that we have to be really careful if we want to make that claim. Because then, for instance, how do you make sense of the fact that 2 + 2 = 4 is the same for everyone? If it is, right, there has to be, it seems that the reason it is the same for everyone derives from the fact that there is a world outside of our subjective experience, which is the determining factor. And our reasons that we utilize to demonstrate the truths of our claims help us illuminate that truth. That would be sort of my view. But I can certainly see your reasoning, and it's a good question, and it's the right question. But I think that you have to dig further. That's what I would say, is that we need to be able to dig further. Otherwise, if we just set it off from there, then that means, for instance, that why don't we teach rain dancing in meteorology schools, right? How do you think, for instance, ask this question: if you take a class, let's say you take a class in anatomy and physiology, how is it that you should? Why is it that you should trust what the professor who's teaching the anatomy and physiology class says? Because it could be that their subjective experience is different. And if that's the case, then, I mean, do you want that person operating on you, who you say, for instance, they have an experience of anatomy and physiology similar to someone, say, in the 13th century, who believes that, for instance, bleeding you, right, will actually cure you of pneumonia? Now, do you agree to that idea, that their claim to bleeding one, to the medieval claim that you can bleed someone to cure them of sickness, do you think that that is as legitimate a claim as, say, for instance, the doctor who gives you an antiviral medication? And I bet you're gonna, if you have to choose the actual medicine, I bet you're gonna go with the doctor, the contemporary doctor who gives you an antiviral medication. Now, why go with them? Do they have a better account of knowledge? Do they actually know the body better? And if they do, then what outside of subjective experience enables us to say that? I mean, that would be sort of the question, I suppose. Anyway, it's a great discussion, and I don't want to. I want us to keep thinking about it. I'd like to hear I'd like you to respond to what I'm saying here and see what you think. Okay? Thank you very much, Carrie. Bye.